Katie Martin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for making the time. I appreciate it. Today is December 12th, 2025, and we are exactly 4 weeks, exactly 1 month from the shutdown finishing, right? I think it was the longest shutdown, right? 43 days
Yep.
from October 1st to November 12th. Um, and I was looking at doing some research, and it cost the government cost us $11 billion. $11 billion, right? The previous one cost $5 billion. So it was the longest and most expensive shutdown. Anyway, but those are figures. And I think the key thing is one of the, I would say, one of the collaterals, if you want, collateral damages, if you want to use that euphemism, is food, SNAP. Um, there was really a threat to folks receiving their SNAP benefits. Um, and I was also surprised to see that um, how many people receive SNAP benefits? 41 million,
40, yeah, close to 42 million.
close to 42 million. And that's I mean that's a sizable chunk of the population. It's something along the, is it 1/8 of the population, something like that?
Something
Um,
like that.
so I want to ask you the first question, the basic question, which is the following. In this country, which is the wealthiest country in the world or in the history of the world, right? How come there are people who still go hungry today? Um, what is behind that? How could it
Yeah.
be?
Yeah, it's a great question because it is a preventable problem. And in a wealthy country where estimates show that we discard and waste about 40% of the food that is produced,
Yeah.
there is plenty of food. And the reason that we have food insecurity or hunger is rooted in systems and policies that make it difficult for millions of Americans to access and afford healthy, nutritious food that they prefer. And it's something that I've committed my career to because it's just not okay that we have such high food insecurity rates. And a lot of these are rooted in policy decisions. It is really a policy choice that we have hunger in America and in other developed countries. Um, and by policy decisions, I mean things like, if you work a full time minimum wage job, you are living under the poverty line. And if you can't afford healthcare and childcare and so many of these costs that have increased dramatically in the last 30 years, and the social safety net has not responded accordingly. And a lot of those are decisions like the SNAP program, which is the first defense against food insecurity. And yet we know that benefits are often pretty limited. Many people are just above the eligibility criteria, and so they're not eligible for SNAP. We add a lot of red tape and policies, that make it difficult for folks to even access federal food assistance programs like SNAP. So there are a lot of underlying root causes. There's also just structural injustices, structural racism, for example, that we know that folks who are most marginalized, who are tend to be Black and Brown families, have the highest rates of food insecurity, and that's not by accident.
Yeah. Okay. Um, so I think one of your well, here's the book that I read, and I'll tell you why I read it. I read it because um, during the leading to the shutdown and during the shutdown, it became very clear that seniors, right, seniors were really threatened by this, and there was a lot of panic, right, compounded with with other, with other like health benefits and then and housing, like the basics, right? They were really in a tight spot, and so I was basically trying to understand why. Why? And it was not a theoretical issue. I mean, I saw folks who were really in a state of anxiety. Okay.
Yeah.
And so and so sort of a crisis triggered me to go and do some research, find out and read your book and so forth. But I think one of the points that you make is that we should not see food hunger or food insecurity as a crisis. We should see it as a chronic situation, which I think speaks to your point, which is there are structural elements to this. So I guess my next question would be, um, this chronic, it's called condition, um, has been long lasting. It's not recent, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. And unfortunately, when we think about especially the charitable food system, so food banks and food pantries that are located in every community across our country, um, we often describe it and call it the emergency food system and talk about emergency programs and emergency needs. And the charitable food system has been around for about 50 years.
Mm.
And when a crisis, when an emergency has lasted decades, it's just a misnomer, it's a
Yep.
misclassification. And that's important because when we think about an emergency, it feels short term. It's like we just need to handle this very quickly and efficiently and respond in the near term. So when you're focused on an emergency, you're not future planning, you're not strategically planning, you're not thinking about how do we really prevent this and solve this. You're just trying to treat this as an emergency. So I think that throws us off from the kinds of underlying root causes that create this problem in the first place and our response to it. So instead of treating it as something that is short term, we have to look at this as this has been a chronic issue. And the US Department of Agriculture has been measuring food insecurity for years now. And this administration just recently announced that they were no longer going to be measuring food insecurity in the same way, which will be challenging. But the data shows that since 1995, the rates of food insecurity have maintained over 10% of all US households since 1995. And some years they fluctuate and it goes up. With the recession, it increased. After the COVID response, when the government took back a lot of the initiatives that they put in place to respond to COVID, food insecurity increased. But even during good, strong financial times in our country, one
Mm.
out of 10 Americans are struggling with food insecurity. So it's not a short-term crisis, it's a long-term chronic issue.
Okay. Um, so when you say structural, okay, let's think about two sort of parallel systems, right? There is our government, which is supposed to serve us, right? Um, and then there is people who basically step in when the government has not been able to fulfill its obligations.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so on both fronts, it seems to me, we haven't had something stable that sort of is there, and we can rely on so that the food situation is always under control, right? And so you have crises and so forth. But how come on both sides, it seems to me, both the food pantries, they run out of stock or whatever it may be, and then they have to do whatever they need to do. And then on the government side, you have these fluctuations between, I don't know, congresses that have different priorities and so on and so forth. So, I mean, do they suffer from the same kind of, or what are the challenges on both the government side and then on the private, I'll call it the charitable track?
Yeah. So I'll address both of those. And then I also want to introduce a third track of, for-profit companies
Profit.
and industries and the
Yeah.
private sector.
Yep.
But on the government side, um, healthcare should be a human right. It should be like food is a human right. The US does not recognize food as a human right, whereas many other developed countries have signed on to agree that it is. Housing, one of our other just most basic needs. We all need shelter. There are government assistance programs for housing assistance, like Section 8. And it's basically like winning the lottery if you're
Mm.
able to get a Section 8 voucher to provide for affordable housing. Um, Even with our federal food assistance programs, rather than making them streamlined and easy, if you apply for one and you're eligible for one, you're automatically enrolled in others. We make people go through multiple hoops to apply and recertify for each individual program, like SNAP and WIC and school meals, other programs like that. Um, so there are a lot of these structural issues from the government side and even anti-poverty initiatives like the minimum wage. Like the minimum wage should be the minimum by which a household should be able to afford basic things like shelter, food, etc. And that has not kept pace with inflation. So I bring in the private sector also because companies can provide living wages, they can provide benefits for employees. And I think there has been a trend over many years where many larger companies are hiring folks just below full time so that they don't have to pay for benefits, as in health insurance. And they pay, very sub wages where even employees are working full time jobs and they don't have enough money and benefits to apply for the basics. The charitable food system, as in food banks and food pantries, and I always think it's interesting and important to differentiate and define what we mean by that. So, for listeners who are unsure about the difference, a food bank, there are about 200 food banks in the country. Wherever you live in the United States, there is a food bank that represents you and where you live. Um, they are a large warehouse, like a Costco. Think of a large warehouse where they collect millions of pounds of food and then distribute that to local agencies like food pantries and meal programs that are in the community, and they serve directly to individuals. So a lot of the reason that I wrote my book was because there are some really awesome, innovative food pantries that are doing wonderful wraparound services and serving folks healthy food with dignity. And then 2 weeks later, or 2 miles down the road, I would see another food pantry that looks like it was 30 years ago when I first got started doing this. And so I wanted to shed light on some of the better practices and ways that we can reduce barriers so that folks don't have to prove that they are poor or that they are deserving of the food. If folks say that they need free food, we should trust that they need free food. So making it low barrier, allowing people to choose their food like they would at the grocery store, like replicating the benefits of SNAP. Like it's dignified when you can go and you can purchase your own food with SNAP benefits. In many traditional food pantries, we're still pre-boxing, pre-bagging food and making those decisions for others. And I work really hard to encourage pantries to let folks choose their food and then connecting folks to other resources, whether that's transportation assistance, housing assistance, mental health assistance, et cetera, to provide more of those wraparound supports.
Yeah. I will some of the folks who are watching will connect the dots, and I'll connect them for you in terms of how I took your book, read it, and did something concrete, right? And so I think you're gonna be happy to hear that actually something something I would say for me and for the people involved, something big. We're doing something very meaningful. Thank you for this. This was really very helpful in terms of getting our conceptual framework and our approach, right, and our paradigm to be in the right place. Because we
Yeah.
came in obviously with our own assumptions and and so forth. This was extremely, extremely helpful and educational. But before we go and talk about what we are doing as a result of, directly as a result of your book, I wanted to ask you about give the audience perhaps a country that is doing it well compared to the United States.
So Brazil has historically had very high rates of poverty and food insecurity.
Mhm.
And a few years ago, very recently, they passed a um, Brazil Without Hunger initiative. And it's sponsored by the government and a lot of intervention by the government itself, where they are providing school meals for children, um, direct monetary support, kind of like either the child tax credit or guaranteed basic income that a few
Mhm.
cities in the United States have tried, but nothing at scale. So Brazil has done a lot of really innovative, holistic, like let's really support folks. And they've drastically reduced their food insecurity rates in like 2 years.
Wow.
And it's important because it can be very discouraging to think about this chronic, long-standing problem in the United States and kind of shake our heads and say, well, we've tried different things and it's just so hard. It's so big. It's so hard. And yet seeing examples like what Brazil is doing, or cities that have passed higher minimum wage laws and are passing guaranteed basic, or at least trying piloting some guaranteed basic incomes. There's some promising data that these initiatives work. We just need to scale them.
Yeah. So let's just dig a little deeper into the Brazil. It's called solution, right? Let's say I am a young person, just started a family, right? I'm a teacher. My wife maybe is also a teacher, and let's say for some reason I lose my job, and so we were doing okay, but now we're in a little bit of crisis, and so we need some help. Just making sure that my children, let's say I have two children, that they eat that the routine is not disrupted, that they eat in the morning their breakfast, they have a lunch, and they have a good dinner, and they're eating nutritionally. Let's say I was doing fine, and all of a sudden there's this crisis. How would I, in that world, what would I do? What would I go? What do I need to prove? And maybe we can compare just to make it concrete for the audience. If we take that scenario here, what would that person need to do? And let's say again, they're not elderly and so forth. They're just, let's call them, in their early 30s and just starting a family, and they're working and they want to work and they're looking for employment and so on. But they have a crisis. Yeah.
And that's a great example. So in the United States, we have a school breakfast program and a national school lunch program. The better practices and the ways to make it more universal is just universal school breakfast. You don't have to apply for it. It is just available for all children as they go to school. You take the stigma away from it. Similarly, during COVID, when we launched the summer EBT program, we know that in the summer months when kids are out of school, that's often a really, really challenging time for families because they're relying on school breakfast and school lunch, and now their kids are out for summer. So the summer EBT program, again, just making it streamlined and seamless that we know kids are going to have access to enough food. And it's a great example of, you have a two-parent household. Parents are both working, they're making a decent wage, and then something happens. Someone loses a job. And this is often what triggers food insecurity. You go through some type of crisis, you go through a divorce, you have a big medical issue that strikes you. Maybe it's the car breaking down. It often is something that many of us are going to experience at some point in our lives. And what I would love to see is when that happens, it like within Brazil, I think when you're under a certain income guideline, you just automatically get additional guaranteed income, basically support. And it's so whereas our SNAP program is limited to food purchases,
Mm.
and within SNAP, it's truly meant to be food related. So you can't buy toilet paper, you can't buy cleaning supplies, et cetera, with your SNAP dollars. I love the idea of, let's give people the opportunity to know, give them cash benefits so that they can choose where that money is needed most. And then hopefully that's going to give you that buffer that you don't have that worry and anxiety that goes with being food insecure and how are you going to make ends meet. Then that parent can spend their time focused on finding another job and then getting back on their feet and getting that better job versus having to spend that time really struggling to just find where they can get enough food. And that's often what happens in the US is when, especially a family like that, when you have one working parent, maybe you're not eligible for SNAP. Maybe you're not eligible for WIC and other programs for young children. Then you need to rely on the charitable food system. And many food pantries are open limited hours in the week, limited days. And you have to spend your time shopping in one food pantry and then going to another food pantry, telling your story over and over again, which can be humbling and hard. We want to make it easier for folks to be able to get back on their feet.
Yeah, yeah. And so in the example of Brazil, let's say their income went down by, I don't know, 40% as a result of, let's say they lost their job. What would happen then, and how would they get that difference just so that they are able to get back on their feet, so that the person is able to drive around, go to, put on a suit, go to the interviews, be on time, have access to the internet so that they look for all those things which are necessary, in this day and age to get back on your feet. How would they get that money in? Do they have to apply for it? Just the logistics of it would be.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know all the details, so I'd have to look more into that. But I think they made it very universal. And I think
Mm,
it's on a sliding scale, which makes
mm.
sense.
Yep.
We want to
Yep.
base it on the amount of need that your family has and then hopefully scaling. In the US, we often, when you're eligible for federal food assistance programs, you really have to have very low income, very few assets. And so then if you do get a job and you're just over the threshold, you get this cliff that happens. And I think what we want to do is soften that cliff so that as you're working, we know it's not magically like just when you're a dollar over the federal poverty line that you're doing fine. I mean, it's often what is termed the ALICE population, which
Mm.
is asset limited, income constrained, employed. It's a great acronym because it kind of humanizes it. It's the ALICE population and it's the working poor. And those are folks that often need to rely on the charitable food system because they can't take advantage of the federal food assistance programs, but they're still struggling to get enough food.
Yeah. During the shutdown, I think many states stepped in and tried to help. And I think in a couple of towards the end, I think the federal government was trying to get in their way or some absurdity like that, or indecency, if I may call it like that, right? Um, so tell us about what states can do in the United States versus the federal government, and what's the difference between the two? There's someone who needs food. Do they get both state and federal? Maybe just basic education for the audience. For
Yeah.
me.
So you're right. Knowing in October that the government had shut down and that SNAP benefits were guaranteed through the month of October, but not guaranteed past October. So a lot of politicians, policymakers, advocates were trying to scramble to say, how do we ensure that folks won't have a lapse in their SNAP benefits? So some states really, went ahead and said, we're going to guarantee we will allocate funding. Like New Jersey stepped in and said, well, many states, multiple states stepped in and say, we're going to cover the difference. We're going to make sure that SNAP benefits don't expire come November 1st. Other states didn't take that initiative. I think many folks were just hoping that the government would come back in session and, resolve the shutdown. And for many, many families, there was that worry, that anxiety that takes place when they're hearing on the news that this might happen. And then, in fact, it did. And then when the government reopened, there's not just this magic switch when it just automatically, happens. So I think there are definitely initiatives that states can take, but it's challenging. A lot of times you need a waiver from the federal government to make changes to SNAP benefits. Some states raise the income eligibility criteria and are more beneficial or more, cover more than just the regular SNAP benefit. So, for example, to be eligible for the income eligibility criteria for SNAP is 130% of the US federal poverty line. And some states, like in Connecticut, we've increased that eligibility to 185%, knowing that it's hard, even if you're close to 2 times the poverty rate, you're still struggling. So there are initiatives that states can do and have done. The summer EBT program is another example. Like during COVID, when we realized folks needed extra help,
Yep.
the federal government made it possible for states to allocate EBT or SNAP benefits during the summer months. Some states opted in for that, some states didn't. And, I think that speaks a lot to the political choice, the policy choices that we make to make it easier for folks to get enough food, or to say, no, thanks, we're not going to take advantage of this program. We want folks to just, I think, pull themselves up by their bootstraps somehow.
Yeah. Well, why would the state do that? Why would a governor, is it the governor who decides that? Is it the
Yeah,
governor?
the governor.
Why would the
Yeah.
governor say, no, thank you, we're not going to take that money because it's money. It's almost free money, right? Why would they do that?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question that I would encourage folks in states where governors chose not to allocate summer EBT money to ask those pointed questions. Why would you deny families access to food in the summer months? I think there's sometimes this notion, there's so much talk these days about fraud and abuse, and folks cheating the system. And there's a lot of data showing that, as human beings, there are going to be people who are going to cheat the system. The fraud rates within SNAP are extremely low. And so I think there are some stereotypes about SNAP benefits and who utilizes them. And so I would imagine maybe that there are politicians that feel like um, big folks are just not deserving of it, I guess. But I struggle to
Yeah, I
understand
struggle.
it.
I mean, studies after studies show that whatever fraud is, marginal, is trivial, not marginal, trivial,
Trivial. And
trivial,
the amount
absolutely.
of time and resources that we spend trying to combat the fraud, we should be spending to help folks make the benefits more robust.
Like, for example, I was reading the other day about just the sheer efficiency of the Social Security, system. How, they are better than any private company in terms of delivering the checks on time. It's just an efficient system that just knows and they can track you in terms of if you change address. And so and they were saying like there's no system out there that is as good as the Social Security system. And I think one of the reasons is politicians, that's a red line, don't touch that, right? And so they leave it alone. They don't tamper with it. That's just my naive theory about perhaps why that system is, if these systems are allowed to just, organically and rationally mature to do their job instead of these
Mhm.
interferences, and you shut them down and you reduce staff and you do this and you do that and change policy, change rules. If you leave them alone, they will do fine. They will do just fine, right? At least that's sort of part of my. So then I'm thinking, Is it these claims of fraud, are they the same kind of in nature? You don't need to say anything if you don't feel comfortable. Like vote, like claim there's voting fraud when there is not, right? There isn't just there's the evidence is overwhelming, and obviously,
Yeah,
the question is, well, how come some people are impervious to evidence, which is pretty, it's out there, right? It's clear, right? Is it the
yeah,
same kind of forces you think that are maybe?
yeah. I would venture to say that, um, it's this idea of like the misinformation and
Yeah.
sowing doubt in folks' minds. It stirs up the stereotypes, and um, I think it's our jobs in many ways within food advocacy to raise awareness about the facts, tell stories and experiences from those who are experiencing food insecurity, their lived experience, to dispel a lot of those myths, a lot of the stereotypes, the jargon that goes into um, making it seem like there is more abuse than there is. And I also think it's telling how during the COVID
Mm.
crisis, it's important to think about how when there was this outside force, this virus that, was beyond any of our control initially,
Mm.
and people lost their jobs, their livelihoods by no fault of their own, that the government on many bipartisan levels went above and beyond to say, how do we reduce the red tape? How do we increase benefits? How do we make it easier for folks to get by? Eviction moratoriums, like halting student loan
Mhm.
payments, so many things that we just said, let's put full force effort here. Those efforts made a huge difference. The expanding the child tax credit cut child poverty basically in half during COVID at the beginning. And then we reversed those benefits, we reversed those policies, and went back to this notion of we need people to prove that they're deserving and that they're actually really, really poor and they really need assistance. And I think in our society we have this notion that um, if you're living in poverty or you're food insecure, it's your own fault basically, and not recognizing that it's these systems and structures that are in place that make it hard.
Yeah. Do you think, and maybe it's symbiotic, do you think it's cultural? You think it's the nature of our, I don't know if I may call it our capitalist system where, a company is trying to always, especially if it's a public company or even if it's not, trying to show that they are always growing, there's profit, and so they're always squeezing the working folks. That's the biggest expense, right? So keeping the wage as down as possible, the benefits as down as possible, and so that the culture perhaps is the culture of this don't trust is perhaps a byproduct, perhaps of the underlying political or let's say economic system of how wealth is generated and I would say distributed or not distributed. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's instructive to think historically of how the income inequality gap has been widening. And when that started, I would argue, and looking at it, it really was in the 1970s, and then it has been growing and growing. And I think it's somebody was describing recently, we have a K economy. So if you think of the
Mm,
letter K,
mm,
that half of Americans,
mhm.
their
Yep.
incomes are increasing and access to wealth is increasing. Probably it would be a smaller top of the K. Whereas there are so
Yes.
many
Yes.
millions of Americans where everything is becoming more expensive and it's just harder and harder to get by. And, I think a lot of those things, one way to think about food insecurity is a market failure. That when companies, when they create policies and the government supports this, I think there are some government policies that enable this, but then corporations that can pay sub minimum wages and those prey upon those who are most marginalized. And so there are folks that have been left out of the better economy and having assistance for, when you think back to redlining and Black Americans and Latino Americans, like not having access to bank credit or housing mortgages. And that like perpetuates over generations. So, I think what we're experiencing now, and we're seeing this income inequality, has been going on for decades. And I think it's something that can be reversed, like we've seen with Brazil and some other really strong initiatives. It takes the political will to do it.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I mean, there is that inequality, and also something that has always struck me is productivity in the starting from the late 70s. Um, Productivity just went up the roof in terms of the worker, right? And whereas, so you have this sort of classic chart of it, you have two lines, right? One going like that, productivity, and then you have in terms of compensation. So there is
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
gap between how much wealth you're generating and how much you're being compensated for it, that I think is probably driving, like, where's that wealth going? It's going to the top, 1%.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.